Chapter 13 Descent. The whirring of helicopter blades filled the skies, so much so, in fact, that even the pilots with the headsets could barely hear one another. Kong's weight demanded literally dozens of them flying in perfect formation at all times while keeping constant communication so as to not hit each other. "This is insane, Nathan," Dr. Andrews yelled into her mic. "I know," he yelled back. Dr. Sarisawa, Dr. Chen, Mark, Maya, Joe, and Ford were all crammed into one of the choppers, with each other holding onto the sides and to each other for balance due to the turbulence. Kong, meanwhile, rested peacefully on a net held between the helicopter. After almost an hour and a half of flying over the Antarctic ice, they finally reached their destination. A massive cave entrance within the inner cave walls lined with technological support, strings of lights and scanners and monitors everywhere. Outside, lining a semi-circular cliff face, which which the cave rested within, were 3 and 4 massive buildings built into the ice, one of which had a helicopter landing pad on it. The helicopter with the team landed, and everyone hopped out, ducking their heads and covering their ears as the other helicopters carrying Kong rolled in behind them. Hovering over the center of the opening of the cave, they all lowered Kong to the ice and severed the cable lines. One by one, they turned around to return to the naval ships from whence they came, while the team dashed through the stairs and holes to reach a high platform so Kong would see them. The snap of the cable did the trick. Kong's eyes opened and looked left and right. "What is this?" He sat up slowly before taking a handful of strange white powder and holding it up to sniff it. "It almost smells like water, but it is not water." He opened his mouth and shoveled the snow inside. "Wait, it is water." Kong shoveled more snow into his mouth for several long moments to enjoy the drink of pure water he had in what felt like an eternity since leaving the island. "Ah, that was good." Kong's eyes suddenly narrowed, and he released a slow growl. "Wait, where is the other?" He quickly stood up and looked around, but there was no sign. "Is he not here?" He continued scanning the area before his eyes fell upon the upper platform where Gia and the others stood watching him. "They are all here." He approached slowly, which got Dr. Lin to swallow a lump in his throat. Kong looked at Gia as she stepped forward and pointed to the cave entrance. "Home," she sighed. Kong looked at the cave with curiosity and incredulity in an equal measure before looking at Gia again. "It is a paradise at the end. A beautiful place," she sighed. Kong sat down and began signing back, much to the extreme joy of Dr. Andrews, who followed and translated the conversation for everyone. Why is home in a rock?" Kong sighed. "The rock is just here. There is more inside," Gia replied. "Home is the island." Gia hesitated and looked back at Dr. Andrews, who gave her a reassuring nod and a gesture to keep going. "Home is gone, swallowed by storms. There is a new home," she sighed. "I do not want new home. I want my home." Gia's face dropped, and her eyes started swelling up. "I miss home too," she began as her first tear fell. "But there is a new home, a beautiful home. We must go to it." Kong's lip tightened, and he glanced at the cave with visible irritation. He sat up and walked over to inspect the entrance and looking into the dark depths of its expanses with only these tiny lights to guide a path ahead. He huffed through his nose and went back to sit and sign with Gia. How can beauty be found in rock? Gia turned around and looked at Dr. Andrews, who stood up straight and ran off, only to return a moment later carrying a geode. She handed it to Gia and signed for her to use it as an example. Gia looked up at Dr. Andrews, tears still staining her face, and the doctor's smile slowly faded as she leaned down and put her forehead to Gia's for comfort. Gia walked up to the edge of the platform and held the geode up for Kong to see as he leaned in closer. This is pretty. It's in the rock, she signed after putting the geode down. It is pretty, but can it be so pretty down there? Kong signed while using his hand to motion towards the cave. Yes, was all Gia could manage. Nathan, this isn't working. Kong's not convinced about the story we came up with, Dr. Andrews said worriedly. Tell him there's more of his family down there, he replied. Nathan, we don't know that. If if we say that what's down there, but Kong doesn't find them, what do you think he'll do? She barked. We have no choice, he barked right back, catching her and some of the others off guard. If he doesn't go in there and reach the hollow earth, then humanity stand, Eileen, he yelled. Then maybe it's best we let it happen, she screamed back at him, which promptly silenced any rebuttal he had planned. She got right up in his face, backing him into the wall. You want us to lie to our Titan, she growled through grit teeth. You want us to dangle family in front of him like some 1920s carrot stick negotiation trick. The more I listen to you, the more I think you have abandoned what humanity you had left after your brother died, she screamed. More than a few mouths fell open at that point, and Jill watched in silence with Kong lowering his head to try and see what was happening inside. Dr. Andrews poked his chest hard. I was on board, telling him there was a paradise down there, but lying to Kong about that one thing we know he misses most in this world is beyond cruel, Nathan. I thought you were better than that. Dr. Andrews turned around and walked up to Gia, cupping her face to her hand, to her face with a smile and using a thumb to wipe her tear stains away. Thank you for trying, Gia. I'm proud of you, she sighed. Gia blinked and wiped her face, and Dr. Andrews approached the edge of the platform, looked up at Kong, and started to sign again. I'm sorry. Kong's head tilted. We do not know for certain what it is inside, but we have a reason to believe that paradise awaits at the end of the tunnel. A beautiful place, a place where other creatures like the ones on your islands may still yet exist. Kong leaned in slowly. How do you know this? She took a deep breath. We don't know. We hope and pray. We want to be happy. We want you to be happy. We want you to have a home not shrouded in unending rain and winds, where you would never see the light or feel the warmth of the sun again. And we think that's what is inside. Kong got up onto his forelimbs and hunched down to take a long look at Dr. Andrews as Gia came up and gripped the bottom of her jacket, still holding her Kong dolls. He looked between the girls to the cave and back to their face. He looked at the geode on the ground and back to the cave. And at last, he looked at Dr. Andrews and stood up straight, looming tall like a mountain over her. Do you promise there is no lie here? That what awaits is home, and that if I do not like it, I may return to the island? Dr. Andrew smiled and nodded her head, and that was all Kong needed. He turned to the cave and lurched forward into a classic gorilla run as his knuckle straight into the cave. As he ran on his knuckle straight into the cave. Let's go! Into the heaves! Dr. Lin shouted. Everyone piled into the vehicles and shot after Kong, who was already thousands of meters ahead by the time they made it inside. Damn, he can move, Mark said in wonder. What do you expect, Mark? Dr. Chen asked teasingly. Well, not that, he replied with a chuckle. Kong's pace pushed the heaves to their limits as they fought to catch up and keep up. The low-hanging stalactites and rising stalagmites of the caves forced them to sometimes slow and adjust course as not to crash. But Kong either burst through them or manages to maneuver over and under them fluidly, with far more grace than one would expect of a creature his size. Do gorillas always move like that? Ford asked. Not usually. It looks like Kong picked up a few tricks though, Mark replied. Yay for the monkey, Maya commented sarcastically as she pushed a button on a small device in a pocket. In Hong Kong, her father stood in a large command room surrounded by underlings, working frantically at dozens of computer stations, all connected to a single massive monitor in front of him. Mr. Simmons, you have a message, shouted one of the underlings. Put it on monitor 1, he replied. It was a single word, descent, and the corner of his lips curled into a smile. Inside the heaves, the team all held on tight as Kong reached a sheer drop, and they all began to follow downwards into a near perfectly vertical dive, with Kong now in a free fall, losing his grips on the side. What's that? Dr. Chen yelled. That's the real entrance to the hollow earth, Dr. Yen Lin replied. Their descent led directly towards a strange glowing liquid-like light flowing around the edge of the cave. It was almost direct, out of sci-fi film. Some kind of portal or electromagnetic anomaly. Brace yourselves, Dr. Lin cried as they got closer. Kong hit the portal first and disappeared within it, and the heaves were soon to follow. Once inside, the sky, if it could be called that, was a wash of dark blues and purples and filled with light flashing by, leaving long streaks into the air behind them. Almost all sounds were muddied and muffled out so the team couldn't even hear themselves grunting against the gravity inversion as it slowly took hold. And true to Dr. Lin's word, it felt like a weight being attached to and pulling on their intestines. Beautiful, Kong thought despite his own shock and fear of the situation. Another portal-looking anomaly floated ahead, and Kong braced himself to hit it, while the others were all forced their eyes to stay open as they all leaned back in their chairs. Kong hit first and disappeared, and as the heaves struck the darkness within the portal space, the world suddenly went bright, forcing them all to close their eyes and look away. Kong looked down. What is this? Below him was a massive, expansive world, a lush world, green everywhere, but it also had mountains of dark rock and ash with lava flowing freely. Other areas were desolate and dry like desert, and others were massive expanses of water. It was almost as if the entire world was contained in this space, and although it looked limited in scales at first glance, looking out at the horizon, it seemed as if it went on forever. Is this? Kong didn't have time to finish the thought as he felt his arm brush the edge of a massive mountain. He tried to grip it, but his hand couldn't close because he was falling too fast. He dug his hand into the rock, which started throwing tons upon tons of small bits of rubble out into the air and sent flying towards the heaves. Hang on, the pilot shouted. The heave carrying the team rolled left narrowly, avoiding the first volley of debris. The second heave was not so lucky and saw the left half of the cockpit area struck by one of the rock. It knocked the heave off course and sent it careening down, spinning around and around until the pilot managed to straighten out. Kong's hand finally found a grip right before he would have fallen out into the open space once again, and he hung tight to his perch and started plodding away down while the heaves all fell into the open skies with the engines not cooperating with them. Come on, come on, the pilot growled. What's happening? Maya demanded. The engine's dead. We'll fix it, she shrieked. I'm trying, he barked. The ground was growing larger and larger in the cockpit view, and the trees becoming more and more defined, and the clouds whizzing past, clearing the way for them on the descent. And both heaves seemed to be suffering from a similar issue relating to the engines, and both continued falling as each member of the group braced themselves for what could only be described as a fast, inevitable end. However, at the last moment, that feeling of free fall seemed to vanish as the heaves both felt a sort of sudden turbulence which knocked both the vehicles and their poor occupants for a bit of a loop. Holy shit! Cried the pilot. Everyone opened their eyes and looked up and saw a massive finger gripping the cockpit window. Kong had caught them. Now in a free fall himself and headed for the ground at a rapid pace, Kong braced himself as his feet hit the ground first, and he used the momentum to push forward and rolled several times before skidding to a stop on his back. Kong let out a deep breath and set the heaves down on either side of himself and slowly sat up, rubbing his leg. Even though he landed well, they still took a bit of a beating doing so, and he felt it the most in his knees. Everyone inside the heaves were frozen in silence and disbelief and looking between each other. We're alive? Dr. Lin asked. Looks that way, Mark replied. And we've got Kong to thank, Dr. Lin said, while giving Dr. Andrews said, while giving Dr. Lin a rather harsh glare, which he winced at. The heave pilot continued messing with the controls and then finally roared to life. We're in business, he shouted. About time, Maya grumbled. She reached into her other pocket and clicked another button on a small device, and back in Hong Kong, her father read a single word on his monitor. Source. And an ear-to-ear smile crossed his lips. Mr. Sarisawa, prepare to synthesize the energy source, he called. Ranch, seated near the back of the room, turned to his monitor and opened a program which he left on standby. With the heaves now back in operational order and floating along easily, Kong made it to his feet and took in a big breath of air. This place, it's just like the island. He looked around in all directions in wonder. He then knelt down and picked up a handful of dirt, giving it a whiff before letting it fall to the ground. It even smells like the island. The trees to his left rustled, and a pair of small deer-like creatures trotted out and looked up at him before continuing on their way and stopping to nibble some grass. Those are new, but they are friendly. Kong stood up straight and looked out towards a massive mountain in the distance with a giant light floating above it. There. Kong took off, and the heaves quickly followed suit into the heart of the hollow earth. Congrats, Dr. Lin. You're finishing your brother's mission, Maya commented with a smirk. Dr. Lin smiled uneasily and looked up at Kong as he raced ahead at full speed. Chapter 14. the hollow earth. Bank right! The heave banked hard to one side as a massive flying snake-like creature soared past, its jaws just grazing the rear left engine. The force of the bite sent a small shockwave through the air, tipping the heave off its flight path and nearly spiraling out of control into a mountain face. Kong dove into a shoulder roll and managed to catch the heave with only feet to spare before the rocky grave for its passengers. Setting it down quickly, he turned in the nick of time to catch the jaws of one of the oncoming flying serpents. Its teeth dug into his flesh, causing trickles of blood down his fingers. But he held firm and pushed back with all his might. The creature planted its tails into the ground and pushed back before it, but it was no match for Kong's overwhelming strength. The second creature, however, was now pursuing the other heave with the team on board. Fuck! Shouted the pilot, who banked hard this way and that to avoid the snapping jaws behind them. Can't we lose it? Maya demanded. You wanna pilot this thing? He yelled in response. Everyone else aboard clung tight to the seat, and Jia tied to her Kong doll. The doll's namesake was faring far better than the team, and the heaves as he rolled the serpent to one side and managed to sit atop the creature while shifting his grip to its throat. The serpent's tail whipped and thrashed viciously behind Kong before arching up and wrapping around Kong's throat. His grip on it immediately loosened as his instinct to protect his airway took hold, and his enemy immediately pressed its advantages. Pulling Kong backwards and off of it itself, it manages to slither up and around before wrapping itself around him. Kong's hand gripped its body and dug in tightly for all his worth, but it was no use. Its coiled body was tightening its muscles to the point where it was too much for Kong's usually ironclad grip to do anything about. However, it made one dangerous mistake in its flash of narcissistic showmanships. While rising up with a gaping maw preparing for a killing bite, it left itself open to Kong's own bite. Tucking in his chin and digging his teeth into the body of the serpent sent a stream of green blood coursing through the air as the beast shrieked in agony. Its grip on Kong's throat went slack as the rest of its body flailed wildly in an attempt to escape. But one good bite deserves another, and Kong felt a searing pain spiral through his shoulder as the creature's fang dug into his flesh. Meanwhile, the team's heave continued to desperately outrun and outmaneuver the massive serpent, flying after them over and around the cliffs and the small mountains filled with a densely packed trees. Crap! Shouted Dr. Lin as the seat broke away from its hinges. He and his seat fell to the ground and were tossed around like the ragdolls until Dr. Sarasawa and Dr. Chen were able to grab him onto him and hold him still. The seat, though, was still free, and the pilot again banked hard to avoid a lunge from the serpent. The seat flew up towards the cockpit, slamming into the back of the pilot's head, knocking him unconscious. Shit! Maya screamed as the vehicle began spiraling. Do something! Dr. Andrews demanded. I'm here to babysit, not fly, Maya retorted. Suddenly, a body dove past them. It was Ford, diving into the cockpit area and forcing himself between the pilot and the control. He grabbed them and pulled hard to level the heave out. Once stable, he glanced at the rear monitor, showing the serpent right on the tail. Hang on, he shouted. Ford twisted the controls all the way left, throwing the heave into a barrel roll as the serpent drove past and face first into a mountain. Nice one, Ford, Joe cheered. Ford smiled and pulled back on the control to ascend higher into the air. From here, he could see much more clearly, and not far away was Kong still locked in battle with the other creature. We got anything to help him? Ford called. No, just get us out of here, Ma demanded. How about you stop thinking about yourself for once, Dr. Andrews growled. I'm thinking about our lives, lady, Maya countered. Enough. We need to help Kong, Sarasawa interjected. Ford nodded it and banked towards Kong. The mighty king of Soul Island had managed to bite a large chunk of the serpent whose long, needle-like teeth could not accomplish the same feat against the massive ape-like titan. With his head now free and his hands able to dig into the open wound and started pulling, he tore the wound wide open along the length of its body until it started coughing green blood. Gripping it hard around the tail, he swung it around and slammed it down headfirst into the spiky series of rock in the ground, impaling the center of its cranium and killing it nearly instantly. While attempting to catch his breath, he turned at the sound of the heave approaching. The vehicle came down smoothly and started to circle him, but was also soon followed by the other serpent. Oh crap! Ford exclaimed as he pulled back on the controls. The heave departed the area, joining the second vehicle nearby as Kong snarled at the serpent. You challenged me to battle, serpent. You are the intruder, and the intruder here. Yes, I am. I searched for a new home. Your home was outside this world. Once, but no longer. Return, outsider. I will not. If you do not, the mother will see you ejected by force. What is the mother? Those who do not know the mother only prove that they are not worthy of calling this land home. Kong snarled viciously and dashed at the creature, who subsequently launched right back at him. Kong managed to grab the creature by its jaw, but as with the first, its body managed to coil around him and began squeezing tightly. Pressing his arm together against his body, forced his hand to lose the grip. The creature leaned back, raised its lower jaw, and opened wide as it wrapped its mouth around Kong's head and began a bean attempt to devour him as known surface-dwelling snakes do to their prey. Oh my god! Dr. Angel screamed. We've gotta help him, Horde shouted. This thing have any weapons? No, it's for us. It's for getting us here, not fighting these things, Maya replied sharply. Damn it, Ford exclaimed. He flexed his body. He tried to grab anything his hand could reach while pinning to his chest. He tried to lean his head left and right. He tried moving his legs and kicking, which only resulted in him falling down as the creature's mouth slid further around his lower jaws and neck, teeth sinking into flesh along the way. The smell was wretched. The pain in each tooth as it pierced his skin felt like the stinger of the insect on the island, and not being able to breathe as its body wrapped tighter and tighter around him started causing panic to set in as his heart rate skyrocketed against the lack of expansion of his lungs. The creature's jaw slid down and stretched up round his shoulders. I can't break free. Glancing to the sides, he noticed the light of the sun peeking through the red-pink flesh between the creature's scales. Opening his jaws, he attempts to lean over and bite the creature, but the slimy texture of its innards and the vertical walls it now presented it, given how stretched out it was around him, prevented his fangs from sinking in. But as Kong's consciousness began to fade, he felt a strange heat by his left ears. "What the fuck are you doing?" Maya shrieked. Ford had beelined for Kong and shifted the heave, so its engine sat just above the creature's flesh at the base of the jaw. Cranking that ignition as far as it would go, the engine roared to life, searing the flesh between the scales, turning it a charcoal black. The creature couldn't cry out due to its circumstances, but Kong felt the resonance of its pain through its body as it vibrated, and suddenly Kong's hand shot upwards and slipped out of the small gap created when the creature's focus wavered in its grip. His hand landed on either side of its lower jaw, and using all his strength, he tore outwards to either side, which broke the lower jaw completely, allowing him to rip it into out to the sides. Green blood spilled everywhere, but it didn't matter. He could breathe again, and he had all his strength back without the thing constricting him anymore. With the creature's straw no longer an issue, Kong threw it off himself and walked up with both fists clenched tight together as they rose above his head and came down full force on the cranium. A sickening crunch echoed through the area, and the creature's body went slack. Kong stood up and huffed through his nose at it, and turned his head to see the hive had landed nearby with steam rising from the back end of it. "You moron! You could have killed us!" Maya snapped. "Oh, shut it already!" Ford barked. "Get off the control, now!" she demanded. "And who'll pilot? Hmm?" Jerry muttered. "We'll wake the pilot and let him do his job. That's what he's paid for. Now get off that seat," she growled. "Fine, whatever," Ford grumbled as he stood up. "Looks like the heave's not doing so well after that stunt," the co-pilot said. "You better tell me we're not stranded in this hellhole," Maya said through gritted teeth. "I don't know, ma'am. We'll need to run diagnostic. Might take a bit." "Not like we're going anywhere, anyway," Mark said as he looked out of the cockpit window. Kong had walked over and was kneeling in front of the heave, looking inside. Jill waved at him, and he waved back and sat down to observe as the team opened the rear doors so the co-pilot could check things, and they could give the unconscious lead pilot some fresh air. "It's surprisingly comfortable," Dr. Chen remarked as they walked outside. Indeed, the temperature was perfect, a mild 70 degrees, maybe a few more. A nice warm sun in the form of a massive ball of light in the distance, greenery all around, the sounds of nature. Were it not for the giant dead flying snakes nearby, as well as Kong, one of one would think they were just on a hiking retreat. "How's Kong doing?" Dr. Andrews asked. "Looks like he's doing okay, minus the snake bait," Mark said as he examined the massive ape. "That's a lot of blood, Mr. Rochelle." Kong's fur was drenched in both the blood of the creature, saliva, and his own blood, which dripped freely from the still open puncture wounds. "Why isn't he healing?" Dr. Andrews asked. "What do you mean?" Mark asked. "When he was on the island, he healed from wounds really quickly, but those marks are still bleeding," she replied. Good question," Mark said quietly. "Maybe the saliva has anticoagulant properties," Dr. Chen added. "You'd think," Mark asked. It's possible. We've never we've never studied something like this. But if the creatures draw substance from blood rather than the volume of mass it consumes, then it makes sense that it wouldn't want the blood coagulating and staying inside, she mused. Ah, you're right. With fangs that large and anticoagulant saliva, it would have only need to nick one major artery, i.e. the neck or the upper chest, to drain the blood, while the rest of the body dissolves in its stomach fluid before being regurgitated, he replied. Hey, doctors, I'm sure this must be incredibly fascinating to you, but if you haven't noticed, we're kind of stuck here, Maya interjected. But we're alive, Ford remarked while walking past her and closer to Kong, so he could get a better look up close. Dr. Serizawa, meanwhile, was looking at the massive light in the distance. Serizawa? Dr. Chen asked as she approached. That light is like the sun. It must be part of what gives this underground world the ability to sustain life, he said calmly. Do you think Kong will head there once the heaves are repaired? She asked. He nodded. And what about Godzilla? Do you know do you think he knows what's happening? She asked. He took a deep breath. I wouldn't be surprised, he said in a lower voice. Back on the surface. I cannot sense you. Godzilla surfaced in the Pacific and looked all around. He must have found the ancient grounds. Suddenly, something drew his attention to the northwest. You, the intruder upon our world. You will not escape this time. Godzilla dove under the water and streaked through through the water like a giant bullet towards the direction of Hong Kong where were. In the Apex headquarters, underground chambers, a massive mechanical monstrosity began to stir as a red light flickered and undulated down its back in its eyes.